What's up, home groups? Have you ever thought about what the last words you say to someone might be? Well, since I was a little kid, I had this thought. I had it in my head that I wanted the last thing I ever said to my mom and dad to be, I love you. So if I was headed to my bus stop before school, it might be something like, all right, see you after school. Bye, Mom, I love you. Yes, I have my lunch. I love you. And I'd have to say it again and make sure it was the last thing I said in case it was my last words to her. It may seem silly, but also there's something powerful about intentionally chosen words in our final moments. And so in this month of April, as we're in the Easter season, we'll be looking at some of the last things Jesus said to his disciples before he was crucified. You see, Jesus knew that his time with them was short, so he took advantage of those last days. And it's as if he was saying, hey, before I go, here are some key things that I don't want you to forget. In fact, some of his most profound statements actually happened right before he died. And they were written down by 4 guys. Yes, you know them: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So the fact that Jesus' words were written down is a really good thing because we all tend to forget, right? I mean, we forget where we put our homework, the phone, our retainer, the TV remote, but our tendency to forget impacts more than just that. Our forgetfulness can be one of the biggest barriers really to healthy relationships. For instance, we forget what others have done for us and maybe take them for granted. Or we forget, the things that have happened to others and it communicates a lack of care for them. Or we forget promises that we make and it hurts the feelings of other people. We only remember what we want to remember, and some call it selective memory. But, remembering our version of what happened or only remembering certain parts and erasing the rest, well, we maybe just remember the things that impact what's right in front of us. The same thing can happen with our connection and relationship to God. So when life gets overwhelming or difficult, sometimes we have a selective memory with our faith. We can focus so much on what's happening right in front of us that we forget what God has already done for us in the past. And Jesus knew about this, so he did something to help us with this. So one day, Jesus and his disciples were having dinner. It wasn't just any ordinary meal, though. It was the Passover meal, which was a huge, important, traditional celebration. And so what the disciples didn't realize was that it would be their last meal with Jesus before his death. And Jesus knew this, so because of that, he shared some important things with these people that he was closest to. But before we get to exactly what Jesus said in that moment at dinner, let's talk about what this dinner party was all about. So, hundreds of years before Jesus arrived on earth, God miraculously saved the Jewish people from slavery in Egypt. The Egyptian Pharaoh had been using the Jewish people as slaves for free labor to build his kingdom. So he wasn't planning to let them go anytime soon. God sent a messenger, Moses, to request that the enslaved people be released, be freed. Well, then every time Pharaoh was asked, he said no. So God then sent a plague to get under his skin and speed up this process. These plagues were things like, thousands of frogs and bugs and sickness. And so over and over, God sent a wave of something challenging to get Pharaoh's attention and remind him of why he needed to let God's people go. The last plague was really awful, though. The firstborn child of every family died. Yeah, it's morbid. Well, the Israelite families, however, for them, there was a way out. It sounds kind of wild, but hang with me with this part. So they were told to place some lamb's blood on their door frames as a sign that they were the Israelite people. In the night, God would pass over those homes. So the firstborn male in those homes would be spared and they would still stay alive. Well, the Israelite people obeyed these instructions and their children were saved in the last plague. But it caused so much pain in Egypt that Pharaoh finally allowed them to leave. It was the end of slavery and a new beginning for the Israelite people. So from that moment on, the Israelites, now known as the Jews, had a tradition of remembering the Passover. They have a meal to celebrate how God had rescued their ancestors. They gather around a table and they retell the story of how they were once slaves, but how God rescued them. And just like how many of our holiday traditions include food, so does theirs. So part of the meal included eating bread, bread that didn't have yeast in it because it was really thin. They didn't have time for the yeast to rise. So that kind of bread, and drinking wine. So hold on a second while I show you what I mean. So the unleavened bread was made without yeast, representing how quickly the Israelites had to leave. There's no time to wait for the bread to rise, kind of like a flat, hard bread, right? Well, the wine represents Jesus' blood of the lambs that were sacrificed to save the Jews. Got it? Good. Well, this brings us back to the table where Jesus and his disciples are celebrating. Remember, he's Jewish. He grew up celebrating, remembering, retelling this story of the bread and the wine. And so while he was doing this with his disciples, they probably all knew how the dinner was supposed to go and how the story being retold was supposed to be told, but Jesus did something different with it. So check it out. He took some bread and gave thanks to God for it. Then he broke it into pieces and gave it to the disciples, saying, "This is my body, broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me." After supper, he took the cup. He said, "This is the new covenant between God and his people, an agreement confirmed in my blood, which is poured out as a sacrifice for you." This was a huge moment for the disciples, even though they may not have understood what Jesus meant. They knew that he had just challenged the meaning of their whole past and tradition. They had always celebrated and remembered what had happened a long time ago in Egypt, but now it was about remembering what he was about to do. The bread and the wine represented his body and blood, and he was saying, "These things now represent my incredible love for you, which has just compelled me to live with you and die for you." So every time you eat bread and every time you drink wine, I want you to remember. Remember me. Remember my sacrifice for you. Remember my great love for you. And what I love about this moment is that it's about so much more than just a holiday or a tradition. So the Passover is a special time of remembering. But what about the bread and what about the wine? So the Jewish people had those every day. This is like their normal food. Jesus made two of their most ordinary elements significant part of their life. And Jesus wanted them to remember every time they ate and drank. Why? Because Jesus knew that life would be difficult and painful, and not just for the disciples, but for everyone who read his words in the future, including you and me. Jesus knew that in those difficult moments, it's easy for us to get caught up in what's right in front of us and forget where we came from. It's easy for us to focus on the bad and forget the good. It's easy for us to forget that Jesus died to demonstrate his great and unfailing love for us. So Jesus knows that we tend to forget, and before he left, he taught his disciples to remember. Why is that so important? Well, putting it simply, remembering reminds us of what Jesus has done, is doing, and will continue to do. Remembering isn't just about being sentimental or inner feels. It's a foundation of our faith. The things we look back on are moments that help us continue to grow in our faith. For myself, I have to remember God's faithfulness in my own life to get me through difficult times. And guys, recently I just found out that I'm going to have knee surgery after a recent injury. And it's extremely disappointing, kind of depressing, especially when I think about the plans and trips that I have had to cancel for this next season of my life that I'm walking into. And not being physically independent or able to care for my two small children how I want to, but I have to remember how the Lord has showed up for me in the past and how he will continue to show up for me again. And my friends in my small group remind me of this too. So what does remembering look like for you? For those of you who've been following Jesus for a long time, I'm guessing there have been some significant moments that you can remember. Jesus did something for you maybe at summer camp, at High Def, or in your family, maybe when you first decided to follow him, or when he answered a big prayer of yours. In those moments, it's easy to trust him. It's easy to know that he's there, that he's good, that he's faithful. But I'm also guessing that you don't always feel that way every single day of your life, right? It's easy to feel far away or forget, why did I ever trust Jesus in the first place? If that's you, I want you to remember something. Jesus hasn't changed. Jesus is the same as he was when you first met him, when you first experienced him. He's the same as he was at camp. He's the same as those awesome worship moments at High Def, when you felt all the feels, when you had great conversations, when you felt compelled to make decisions for him, when you were pressing in closely to Jesus. He is the same as he first was in the Passover, and he's the same as he was at the Last Supper. God doesn't change, and Jesus is just God in human body. We have to remember who God is and what God has done for us. Remembering helps us see God in the past so we can trust God in the present. Well, here's what I know. You are 100% guaranteed to go through difficult times in life. We know that. So it's important to decide now that in those difficult times that it won't derail your trust in God. None of us are exempt from the challenging moments, but when you experience those challenges in the present and in the future, you can lean on the one who has always been there for you in the past. Remembering reminds us of what Jesus has done, is doing, and will continue to do. All right, guys, as you head into your group discussions, I'd love for you to think about your response to this question. What is something that Jesus has done in the past in your life that would be helpful for you to remember today? All right, guys, thanks for listening. Hope you have a great home group. We'll see y'all later.
What's up, home groups? How are you doing? Good? Glad to hear it. We have a few things that we want to make sure you know about before you dive into your discussions this week. Number one, the South Texas Serve Trip. This summer, specifically mid-July, PTSM high schoolers will be taking a trip down to Mission, Texas to help build a home for a low-income community. The trip is a mixture of manual labor and relational connection, as we'll be working alongside the family that will be living in the home. We'd love for you to consider joining us on this trip. Because spots are limited, this trip does require an application. You can apply at prestontrail.org/events. We'll also be having an informational meeting on Sunday, April 23rd during the 9:15 and 11 a.m. service. Number two, if you're signed up for Camp Eagle before or on April 2nd, your swag packs are almost ready. You can come and pick them up in the rail starting on April 23rd. And if you're not signed up for camp right now, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, it's not too late. We still have some available spots. Register at prestontrail.org/events. Number three, finally, all seniors, listen up. PTSM Grad Night is quickly approaching. Join us on Tuesday, May 9th as we celebrate you alongside your families. You don't want to miss out on this special night. Registration closes on May 1st, so sign up now. Thank you for joining us. Have a great small group. And in the theme of famous last words, I leave you with the famous last words of Winston Churchill. I'm bored with it all. See you later.
We forget that. Wow. Nope. I'm just going to back up a little bit. Woo.
Forget the next line.
Forget what I'm going to say. Forget things.